The title of this presentation is Elephants in El Cuarto, the Racial Politics of Spanish Language Instruction. And the first slide, I'm going to start on a personal note. When I was in high school, I had the opportunity to study in Spain for a summer and live with a Spanish family in Madrid. And as I entitled this slide, Study at Home, or Study Abroad rather, Study at Home, because prior to leaving on the trip, my Chilean Spanish teacher, she was really wonderful, Senora Alvarez, and I learned a lot. She was a great teacher. But prior to my leaving on this trip, in our classroom of probably about 30 students, there was myself and one other girl who we were both excelled in Spanish. This other girl looked kind of like this, the slide on the left with a blonde girl with green eyes. And my teacher, Senora Alvarez, looked at let's call her Molly, and said, oh, they'll love you in Spain. They'll just tell you how beautiful you are. She says this in Spanish. And then she kind of looks at me and then moves on with a lesson. And while I felt really encouraged and affirmed by Senora Alvarez, this particular moment, I was very embarrassed and felt really badly. I remember as a young person, and I realized that was a kind of beginning moment for me in recognizing this racial hierarchy that exists within Latin American nations, and also exists with Spain, exists globally. But this was kind of a kind of moment that stands out for me as a beginning of this my understanding of how racial hierarchy works within Latin America. And so I say that the first elephant is the fact that there were about 10 times the number of Africans who were brought to the U.S. were brought to Latin America. So you had, for example, almost 2 million Africans being brought to Cuba alone. You had 5 million being brought to Brazil, many of those actually in the 19th century following the Haitian Revolution. So you really have a strong presence of Latin Americans of African origin. Right, so you have Afro-Ecuadorians, Afro-Mexicans, of course, Afro-Cubans, Brazilians, etc., Dominicans. And what happens in the U.S. context is that they're rendered fairly invisible, right? So they're kind of homogenized into this general group of Blackness and Black Americans, right? So they're read as being American. And so the second elephant in El Cuarto is that there is a particular hierarchy, racial hierarchy within Latin America, right? And this racial hierarchy is founded on enslavement of Africans and indigenous people, and the subjugation and conquest of indigenous people, and the higher value, essentially, and resources and privileges that were placed upon Spanish and Portuguese. So you have this hierarchy, this racial and national hierarchy in Latin American societies. And as you see from the slide, you see that the Peninsular, the folks who were from the mainland or the metropole, from Spain, from Portugal, were at the top of that hierarchy. Then you have those people who were born in the colonies, those whites who were born in the colonies, and then you have Indios and Negros. Depending upon the particular moment in the particular nation, sometimes the Negros were positioned above Indios. And so there's a clear racial hierarchy and position in Latin American societies, right? And what happens is that there are a few things that happen. One is that as Latin American countries were emerging from their colonial status, the idea of a mixed nation, right? A nation that is founded upon a mixed racial heritage was valorized, right? So you have this ideology, national ideologies of mestizaje, national ideologies of colorblindness, also national ideologies of, in Brazil, you call it a racial democracy. So there's this notion, right, that this the indigenous and the African presence within these nations are actually something to be acknowledged and one would think celebrated, right? At least rhetorically celebrated. That we're all, in other words, we're all, mixters, as Jose Marti famously said, that, where there are no, Cubans are more than whites, more than blacks, more than mulattoes. The Cubanness is what is primary. The national identity is what is primary. That is the kind of point of unification. And so that's the kind of ideology, the national ideology, right? That race, really, color does not matter, does not determine one's life chances. However, in practice, what you find is that those people of African origin are overrepresented on the lowest kind of spectrum of society. So both economically, socially, right? So what is valued is aesthetically, is a lighter or whiter appearance, right? And you see this image of Sammy Sosa, who's a Dominican ball player, who lightened his skin, put in lighter contacts, straightened his hair, etc. And you see this kind of contrast in this way that he, as he ascended the economic ladder, he literally physically whitened himself. And there was an expression in Brazil that money whitens, right? So the idea that you have, that to be white is to be privileged, right? This association between whiteness and privilege is very much embedded within Latin American societies and cultures. And so the part of the kind of contradictions that we see are between the ideologies of equality, ideologies of racelessness and, kind of racial democracy, and then the realities of discrimination, the realities of anti-Black discrimination and anti-Black ideologies, is really deep-rooted belief in Black inferiority. And so you have that people are coming into the United States, immigrants are coming into the United States with these ideologies, right? Again, these kind of conflicting ideas about racelessness as a national ideology, and then the reality of a very deeply entrenched belief in Black inferiority, in particular, and Indigenous inferiority as well. So you see this kind of map represents this movement of Latin Americans into the United States, and they're bringing many, many things with them. Among them are their racial ideologies. Right, and so the histories of people who are immigrating to the U.S. Are rendered invisible, and this slide really is designed to bring forward part of those histories. So on the left-hand side, the patriotismo a prueba, those are caricatures that were developed in the early 20th century in Cuba, when you had this massacre in 1912 of people of color, Black and mulatto Cubans, who were protesting their exclusion from full citizenship at the conclusion of the independence wars. And the slide on the right hand indicates it says "Bienvenidos a los Estados Unidos." So you have this welcome to the United States, and after the Cuban Revolution of 1959, there was a large, of course, influx of Cubans into the United States. And with that, they're walking into a 1959 United States, which segregates them according to race, right? So the racial policies of the United States really reinforce this separation, right, and this idea of Black racial inferiority. And Cubans are privileged. A privileged group of immigrants, as well as those, lighter-skinned Cubans, or a privileged racial group within the United States. Again, you have contradictions because there was tremendous discrimination against Cubans. There was famously signs that said, no dogs, no Cubans, in particular neighborhoods, apartments, etc. So they have a very kind of complicated experience. And the other elephant is this moment that I captured, or there's captured with this slide, which really represents a lot of the social and political conflict between African Americans and Cubans within South Florida. So this moment captures 1990, when Cuban mayors and citizens protested Nelson Mandela's visit to Miami, on the basis that Nelson Mandela did not denounce Fidel Castro, because Fidel Castro, the revolutionary government and Cuba, and really supported the anti-apartheid movement with troops, right? So there was military involvement, and without Cuban military involvement in the Southern African struggle against apartheid, the apartheid, may not have fallen. And so Nelson Mandela acknowledged this, and the Cubans who were exiles in the United States and South Florida really took issue with this and refused to recognize his, or really were critical of him. And so the African American population took offense to this, and so there was a boycott, and there were a lot of problems in the early 90s. And there have been tensions between the Cuban and African American communities in South Florida for various reasons, right? So what I'm trying to do with this presentation is really look at some of the layers of why it is that there might be issues or problems or a particular hesitation around the study of Spanish by people of African descent, Americans of African descent in particular, right? So one of the questions that I ask is, how do we see these racial politics playing out in the classroom? So you have to recognize the particular environment, the social and political environment in which students have lived, right, and are living. And what are some of the ideas that they inherit from their families, from their schools, their communities, et cetera, about, in this case, about Spanish and Spanish language. In the context of Miami, Spanish is a dominant language, right? And so there's kind of documented discrimination against non-Spanish speakers and African Americans in particular, again, because of these ideas about Black racial inferiority, and also just the way in which social networks function, right? And hiring practices function within particular ethnic groups. And so those are, recognizing the racial politics, both that students who are immigrants learn in their countries of origin, and also how those racial politics might transfer or be challenged or reinforced, et cetera, within the U.S. environment, right? That has to come into be considered. And so the second question I ask is there any evidence of this being a factor in low Black student enrollment? So how is it that Black students view, this is a huge generalization, of course, but there's a question to ask, right? Is it, how do some Black students, or, the Black students who may or may not be interested in enrolling in Spanish language classes, what influences their desire to continue in the study of Spanish, right? Are there incidents that are similar to the one that I had, right, where the teacher is perhaps subconsciously communicating a belief in European white superiority and Black inferiority? Is there any evidence of that as a factor in low Black student enrollment? And the third question is, how can we offer students across the racial spectrum alternative narratives of Latin American histories, cultures, and societies that are more inclusive? So I think this question is, ideally, the one question is how do we kind of recruit students, Black students or students who don't tend to enroll in language classes or Spanish language classes? How do we recruit them into the classes, and then how do we kind of give all students a much more kind of balanced, nuanced, and comprehensive understanding of Latin American histories, cultures, and societies? So that I would like it that students who are in high school or in junior high school, in their Spanish language classes, they're learning about the deep kind of range of peoples and cultures that contribute to the national cultures within Latin American countries, right? I was definitely in college before I even learned that there were Afro-Latin Americans, and I had studied Spanish, again, from 6th to 12th grade. So having a much more, again, comprehensive and balanced curriculum, I think would, in language classes would also really move forward our, agenda, or kind of would be representative and demonstrative of a particular investment in rendering an image of Latin America that is more balanced, accurate, and inclusive, and will perhaps retain or assist in retaining Black students who seem to be either under-enrolling or not continuing their enrollment in Spanish language classes. And that is the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you very much.